Stop for a second and strip away the headline noise, because what just happened is not small and it is not technical. A single policy decision quietly exposed something far more dangerous than a trade dispute. It revealed how fragile modern power has become when control over core systems slips away. On the surface, this looks like Canada blocking the export of advanced nuclear technology. But underneath that surface is a deeper rupture. A country that was assumed to be a supplier crossed an invisible line and became a system designer. And another country reacted not with calm, but with urgency. That urgency is the tell. Power today does not collapse with explosions. It erodes when assumptions fail, when access is no longer guaranteed, when certainty disappears from places that were never supposed to feel uncertain. If you think this is just about reactors or retaliation, you are missing the signal. Stay with me, because this moment explains how economic power really moves now. To see why this landed as a strategic shock, we have to be clear about what was actually being controlled long before this decision was announced. To understand what is really unfolding, we have to move past the comforting idea that this was a simple policy disagreement. It was not. At its core, this moment forces a much harder question into the open. Who actually controls the systems that keep modern societies running? For years, the assumption was clear. Advanced economies, especially the United States, would remain the default center of technological gravity. Allies might contribute resources or components, but design authority, licensing power, and deployment decisions would ultimately flow back to Washington. That assumption shaped military planning, infrastructure strategy, and even trade policy. What changed here is not a tariff line or an export rule. What changed is the location of control. When Canada moved first in commercializing and governing this technology, it shifted from participant to gatekeeper. And gatekeepers, by definition, decide who waits and who moves forward. This is why the reaction felt disproportionate to the announcement itself. The issue was never access alone, it was certainty. And certainty, once lost, is very hard to recover. To see how this certainty quietly eroded over time, we need to look backward at the policy choices and economic logic that built this vulnerability piece by piece. This vulnerability did not appear overnight. It was built slowly, through choices that felt reasonable at the time and invisible in isolation. For decades, the United States treated advanced energy systems not as shared national infrastructure, but as market opportunities that needed to justify themselves through short-term returns. Nuclear innovation, by its nature, resists that logic. It is slow, it is regulated, it demands stable institutions, long planning horizons, and public trust. Those requirements clash with an economic model that prioritizes speed, financial engineering, and quarterly performance. As a result, investment drifted away from patient system building and toward activities that produced faster, more legible profits. Canada followed a different path. Instead of asking whether this technology could scale quickly in financial markets, it asked whether it could anchor long-term energy security, workforce development, and industrial coordination. That distinction mattered. Over time, it created institutional memory, regulatory confidence, and design capability. While one system optimized for flexibility and return, the other accumulated control. And control, once embedded in design and licensing, is difficult to dislodge. That is the backdrop against which this decision landed. And once that backdrop is clear, the first real crisis comes sharply into focus. The first real crisis did not arrive with a public confrontation or a dramatic announcement. It arrived quietly, inside planning documents and stalled programs. American military and infrastructure planners had assumed modular nuclear power would be available when needed, flexible, portable, and politically easier to deploy than fossil fuel alternatives. Then that assumption collapsed. Projects slowed, pilot programs paused. Timelines that once felt solid suddenly depended on negotiations rather than engineering. What made this moment destabilizing was not the denial itself, but the realization that there was no immediate domestic fallback. The system had been built on access, not ownership. This is where the shock set in. Because when a strategic system discovers it cannot move without external permission, every other priority becomes uncertain. Budgets stop making sense. Planning turns provisional. Urgency replaces confidence. If this feels like an overreaction, it isn't. Strategic systems run on predictability. When predictability breaks, the crisis is already underway. Pay attention to how quickly this story was framed as retaliation. That framing distracts from the deeper truth that the real vulnerability was internal. To understand why that vulnerability existed at all, we have to look beneath the crisis and examine the hidden mechanics that produced it. Beneath this crisis sits a mechanism that rarely makes headlines because it feels abstract until it suddenly isn't. Over time, the United States shifted from building systems to managing contracts. Capability was broken into pieces, outsourced, optimized, and financialized. What remained at the center was coordination without control. That model works as long as access is assumed, as long as supply chains behave, as long as allies fill the gaps. But when a technology reaches a point where design, licensing, and regulatory authority matter more than raw components, the weakness is exposed. You cannot spreadsheet your way out of a missing system designer. Energy technology is especially unforgiving in this regard. It is not just hardware, it is governance, regulation, training, and trust layered together over decades. Once that stack lives elsewhere, rebuilding it is not a matter of writing bigger checks. It requires time, coherence, and political patience qualities that had been steadily deprioritized. Canada's leverage did not come from a single breakthrough. It came from treating energy as a public system rather than a speculative asset. That choice accumulated quietly until it reached a threshold. And once thresholds are crossed, the system reacts whether it is ready or not. That reaction brings us to the second, sharper crisis, one that moves beyond planning delays and into lived consequences. The second crisis emerges when abstraction turns into pressure. Planning failures can be explained away. Delays can be managed on paper. But when energy uncertainty begins to touch operational systems, the tone changes immediately. Military bases and data infrastructure do not have the luxury of waiting for ideological debates to resolve. They need stable power, reliable timelines, technologies that can be deployed without reopening political fights every time fuel prices spike or supply chains seize up. When that reliability disappears, urgency floods the system. This is where panic replaces strategy. Calls intensify to fast-track approvals, loosen oversight, and pour public money into private contractors in the name of catching up. Speed becomes the priority, even if structure is missing. But speed without coordination does not restore sovereignty. It often deepens dependence by locking in emergency solutions that are expensive, fragile, and hard to unwind. What looks like decisive action is often a sign of systems under strain. The louder the rush to move quickly, the clearer it becomes that long-term capacity was never built in the first place. And when strategic stress accelerates like this, it never stays confined to institutions. It begins to spill outward. That spillover is where the story stops being abstract and starts becoming personal. This is the point where you enter the story, even if no one tells you that directly. When strategic systems strain, the costs do not land on spreadsheets or briefing slides. They land on people. Energy uncertainty at the top translates into higher prices, delayed projects, and stop-and-start investment at the local level. It means communities near bases or industrial sites live with postponed upgrades and temporary fixes instead of stable infrastructure. It means fewer long-term skilled jobs and more short-term contracts that vanish when priorities shift again. You feel it as volatility, as bills that creep upward, as public projects that are announced, paused, and quietly shelved. None of this is accidental. When public capacity is hollowed out, the burden doesn't disappear. It gets redistributed downward. And here's the hardest part. You had no vote in most of the decisions that created this vulnerability. The gains flowed upward for years. The risks were socialized. Now the consequences arrive slowly, diffusely, and without a clear moment to protest. If this resonates, don't dismiss it as distant policy drama. These patterns repeat because they are rarely connected back to everyday life. Share what you're noticing. Stay engaged. This is how invisible systems stay invisible. Because once these pressures spread, they don't stop at borders. They cascade outward. Once these pressures escape national boundaries, they move fast. Energy systems are globally entangled, and when control shifts in one place, the effects ripple outward through alliances, supply chains, and strategic planning far beyond the original dispute. What allies notice first is not the technology itself, but the precedent. If access can be constrained here, it can be constrained elsewhere. That realization forces recalculation. Military planners reassess dependencies. Governments quietly revisit assumptions about shared infrastructure. Firms hedge, duplicate, or delay investment while they wait to see where control will settle next. This is how fragmentation begins, not with declarations, but with caution. Cooperation becomes conditional. Trust becomes transactional. Countries with retained public capacity gain leverage not through aggression, but through preparedness. Those without it find themselves negotiating from weakness, even when formal alliances remain intact. The geopolitical danger here is subtle. It is not open conflict. It is divergence. As capacities spread unevenly, coordination becomes harder and collective action slows. And in a world facing climate stress, digital expansion, and security risks, slower coordination is itself a form of instability. To understand where this path might lead, we have to look forward toward the futures this moment makes possible. From here, 3 futures begin to take shape, and none of them are abstract. In the best case, this moment triggers a genuine reckoning. Public investment returns to foundational systems. Energy, infrastructure, and advanced manufacturing are treated as shared capabilities rather than optional markets. Institutions rebuild slowly, deliberately, with clear missions and long time horizons. Cooperation becomes possible again, not because access is assumed, but because capacity is comparable. This path is difficult, expensive, and politically unglamorous, but it restores balance. The middle path is more familiar. Emergency funding flows, regulations are bent, contracts are rushed. Some capacity is rebuilt, but much of the control remains private and fragmented. The system looks functional on the surface, yet the same vulnerabilities persist underneath. Crises become episodic rather than constant, but they never fully disappear. Stability is simulated, not secured. The worst case is quieter. Patch follows patch. Access is negotiated case by case. Dependence hardens. Public institutions weaken further as responsibility shifts outward. When the next shock arrives, technological, geopolitical, or environmental, the response window is narrower and the costs are higher. Sovereignty becomes a slogan rather than a condition. None of these outcomes are inevitable. They are shaped by choices made now, often framed as technical fixes, but carrying structural consequences. And that brings us to the final question this moment forces us to confront. What this episode ultimately reveals is uncomfortable precisely because it is not dramatic. There was no collapse, no declaration, no final showdown, just a quiet decision followed by a loud reaction. And that contrast tells you almost everything you need to know. Modern sovereignty is not defended at press conferences. It is built or neglected over decades. It lives in regulatory competence, institutional memory, skilled workforces, and the patience to invest in systems that do not reward speed. When those foundations erode, power doesn't vanish, it migrates. This is why moments like this matter. They are not anomalies, they are signals. Signals that tell you which societies treated resilience as an asset and which treated it as an inefficiency. Signals that explain why emergencies now feel constant and why responses feel rushed and incomplete. If you take one thing from this, let it be this. Economic strength is not about reacting faster. It is about needing to react less. That requires rebuilding public purpose, not just negotiating access. If you want to keep unpacking how these hidden systems shape your daily life, your energy costs, your job security, your political stability, stay with me. Pay attention to what gets framed as technical. That's where the real power shifts are happening. This story doesn't end here. It's only beginning.